Hello, students and staff of Richmond High School. I'm very proud to be here today with members of our student council. We are here to celebrate an American hero, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is best known for his role in the advancement of civil rights, social justice, and equality for all human beings. Dr. King believed and modeled for us that by using peaceful and nonviolent methods, that we can indeed not only change our schools, our communities, but also our country and our world. I am very proud, as I said, to let you know that our student council and those members of student council that you will see today have put together this program for the staff and students of Richmond High School. We hope that you enjoy our celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man of immense character and moral fortitude. We know him today as the very face of the civil rights movement and a champion of equality and justice. Dr. King's life is an example to us all of what it means to create meaningful change and what it means to live by one's principles. Dr. King was born on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He grew up and was educated in Atlanta until attending Morehouse College and graduating in 1948 with a degree in sociology. At 25, King became the pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, where he lived with his wife, Coretta Scott King. It was around this point in his life that Dr. King became heavily involved in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King's activism was heavily influenced by his religious beliefs. His faith was strongly based in the idea of loving thy neighbor as thyself and loving God above everything. The principle of turning the other cheek from the Sermon on the Mount had a heavy influence on his nonviolent activism. It was a principle he carried with him and led others with throughout his leadership of the civil rights movement. The event that garnered King national attention was his leadership of the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott lasted for 385 days, during which King's Montgomery home was bombed and he himself was arrested. However, the boycott ended with a U.S. District Court ruling in the case Browder versus Gale that ended racial segregation on all Montgomery public buses. The victory over one of the Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation in the South, would be the first of many for Dr. King. After the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, King founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, Joseph Lowry, and several other civil rights leaders in 1957. The Leadership Conference became involved in a desegregation movement in Albany, Georgia, during which King was arrested. The conference helped lead a similar campaign against segregation and economic injustice in Birmingham, Alabama, during which King was again arrested and wrote the famous Letter from Birmingham Jail. King and the SCLC would go on to organize movements in St. Augustine, Florida, Selma, Alabama, and Chicago, Illinois. His work spread across the country and helped bring civil rights to impoverished citizens everywhere. King's most noted and arguably his crowning achievement was the SCLC's 1963 March on Washington, during which King gave his universally known I Have a Dream speech. 250,000 people were present to hear King speak from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington was the largest protest in Washington, D.C. history at the time. In 1968, King was working with the SCLC to organize the Poor People's Campaign, in which mass protests would descend on Washington and demand an economic bill of rights for impoverished Americans. It was a bold plan that rocked the civil rights movement. However, Dr. King would not live to see it realized. In March of 1968, King went to Memphis to support African American sanitary workers who had been on strike there. He delivered his last speech to a rally at the Masonic Temple. He closed his last speech with a reference to a bomb threat to his plane, stating, "I am so happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot at 6:01 p.m. on April 4th, 1968, as he stood on the balcony of his Memphis motel room. After an emergency surgery, he was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. King's controversial Poor People's Campaign proceeded in wake of his passing on May 2nd, 1968. Protesters set up camp on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. They stayed for 6 weeks. Dr. King would have turned 78 this past Friday.
So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. And so we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. And so we watch them in brutal solidarity burning the huts of a poor village, but we realize that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. For those who ask the question, aren't you a civil rights leader? And thereby mean to exclude me from the movement for peace, I have this further answer. In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for black people, but instead affirm the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear.
Good morning. Today, I'm extremely excited and honored to have this opportunity to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm even more excited to show this man's legacy in its entirety. Every year, we solely discuss about Dr. King's civil rights career and his effort to end Jim Crow. The injustices in the Jim Crow era were simply terrible. During this era, thousands of African Americans were barbarically abused and denied basic rights, such as the right to vote and to simply sit at the same lunch counter as white people. This was a deliberate creation of a racial caste system which placed whites above blacks. Dr. King made great efforts to end Jim Crow. His passion for civil rights and his ability to lobby and speak eventually pushed Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In this regard, King was phenomenal, but there's still more to this man. I believe that we focus on Dr. King's civil rights career every year because in the modern era, we believe that everyone deserves basic human rights. Although it shows how much we have progressed as a nation, Dr. King advocated for so much more. He advocated for the end of war and poverty. With this in mind, it is our duty to celebrate Dr. King in his entirety by recognizing how radical yet patriotic he was, looking at his efforts to end war and poverty, and how we all could be like the radical King. Firstly, we must recognize how radical Dr. King was. Radicalism has the goal to end injustices by dismantling structures of power. Dr. King wanted to end racism, war, and poverty through peaceful campaigns and advocacy. He protested even after people spat on him, stabbed him, and bombed him. During his life, he was arrested 29 times, but not for petty crimes, but for protesting against racism. This is why the FBI called him, quote, the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation. Dr. King was brilliantly dangerous. He was not menacing like a domestic terrorist, but rather dangerous to the status quo. Dr. King refused to stay silent about the injustices in this country. He was a radical for justice, but a patriot at heart. Patriotism is simply love for your country. Using my life example, my parents have unwavering love for me. However, when I'm out of line, they will take the necessary steps to correct me, like when I'm out late or do not clean my room. Likewise, Dr. King's love for this country was so deep that he would actively criticize the nation in order to preserve it. King's love for this country was mainly extended towards those who were disadvantaged. He was not solely an advocate for people of color, but he also advocated for those who were poor. He said, quote, "What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger?" As his activist career continued, he became very critical of America's militarism. For example, he called the United States government, quote, "the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today." Dr. King was against billions of dollars being spent on war instead of being used for domestic programs such as public education and health care. As he said, quote, "The bombs of Vietnam explode at home. They destroy the hopes and possibilities for a decent America." Dr. King refused to believe that our efforts in Vietnam were ever justified, and often discussed about how this was a national moral issue. He claimed that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual doom. King's opinions on this war challenged the traditional view of American warfare. His radical views led him to being very disliked. According to a Gallup poll, towards the end of his life, Dr. King had a 63% disapproval rating. As we reflect on this man's viewpoint of militarism, what would King say about war today? $1.7 trillion has been invested in the United States' global war on terror. These wars, similar to Vietnam, have been long-winded and seemingly unwinnable. Dr. King might ask, were these two conflicts truly worth it? Was it worth the destruction of those regions abroad? Was it worth the deaths of our men and women in arms? Was it worth placing billions of dollars into foreign warfare instead of programs of domestic uplift? These are the critical questions that Dr. King pondered during his campaign against Vietnam, and quite possibly the same questions he would have pondered today if he were alive. As I said earlier, Dr. King's main issue with Vietnam was that economic injustice was ignored in the United States during the time. Thus, King's advocacy for the poor was one of his largest concerns and campaigns. It is said that King's push for economic justice and his plan to march on Washington for these issues are some of the reasons why he was assassinated. Dr. King wanted to organize a poor people's campaign to demand that the United States invest in finding jobs, health care, and adequate housing for the poor. As stated previously, his advocacy for the poor extended past color lines. For example, when Malcolm X and others began talking about black power, Dr. King warned that this would, quote, alienate white allies and undermine a genuine interracial movement for economic justice. King argued that economic injustice was against American values, saying that, quote, if a man does not have a job or an income, he neither has life, nor liberty, nor the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. As his activist career continued, he often traveled with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to advocate for reform in poor regions in the country. Unfortunately, King was assassinated just days before his largest potential march on Washington, D.C. for economic justice. If King were alive today, what would he say about poverty? The wealth gap that concerned Dr. King has expanded. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 47 million Americans live in poverty today. Even in our own town, 20% of Richmond is living under the poverty line. Additionally, national income inequality is at an all-time high. The top 1% own more wealth than the bottom 90% of Americans combined. Not only that, in the modern day, a vast amount of poor people are funneled into our nation's prisons unjustly. If King was still alive, he would have been at the forefront of fixing these issues. He would have been a prominent leader in a movement similar to Occupy Wall Street. He would have been a strong opponent of mass incarceration in the United States. Dr. King's personality and speaking power would have been essential in order to further seek justice in the 21st century. Unfortunately, he is gone, but his message for justice still remains, and we can continue his dream. Dr. King did a tremendous amount for justice during his lifetime, but we should not think he was above us. To quote Dr. Cornel West, we have to resist the Santa Clausification of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Often, we place Dr. King on such an impossible platform. He was a great speaker and a great leader, but he was just a person like you or me. Dr. King was one of thousands of civil rights leaders and activists like Jesse Jackson or Rosa Parks. These passionate people worked with Dr. King to make America a better country. These civil rights leaders were supported by many thousands of event coordinators, volunteer security, and general supporters. These behind-the-scenes individuals had passion to change the country for the better. These civil rights leaders were supported by many thousands of event coordinators, volunteer security, and general supporters. These behind-the-scenes individuals had passion to change this country for the better. Without the support of these regular people, the civil rights movement would not have achieved what it has. We all do not have to aspire to be in the same position as Dr. King, yet at the same time, we can aspire to do more. If our love for this country is strong enough, like Dr. King's, then we should take the effort to improve this nation, regardless of our individual positions. As King said, a man has not begun to live until he could rise above the narrow confines of his own individual concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. It is essential that we as a city have the same passion for justice and equality like Dr. King and those who marched with him. In closing, to expand on Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, let freedom ring for those who are affected by American militarism here and abroad. Let freedom ring for those in this country who are poor or disadvantaged. Let freedom ring from our nation's government who has not completely fulfilled Dr. King's dream. Let freedom ring everywhere on earth. In order to truly let freedom ring, we all must be like the Radical King. Thank you.
We have a hard time talking about the truth, and we have a hard time accepting it. The truth about Dr. King was that he was not perfect. He was not a perfect activist, not a perfect speaker, not a perfect father, not a perfect husband, and most importantly, not a perfect man. Both during and after his life, his flaws were subject to controversy. Some believe that his mistakes invalidated the great strides he took for his people. Dr. King inspires me because his imperfect life is a reminder that people are capable of doing both good and bad things, but that this does not stop you from doing great things. And that in doing great things, your love is limitless.
Dr. King inspires me in many ways. Any dream is worth the struggle. Dreams are scary and we may not always understand them, but we must not forget that dreams are powerful. Let us not give in to the negative comments in life. Let us stick to the objective and strive to push each other towards success. Anything is possible.
Dr. King has inspired me to believe in what I believe, in what I think is right. He's definitely inspired me to know that I can be the change. Change starts with me, and even one person, there can be thousands, maybe millions of more who believe in me.
I think Dr. King inspires me with his patriotism more than anything, because he didn't submit to the idea that there was a definition of what it meant to be an American, or that you have to meet a certain criteria, that you create your own definition of what it is to be an American. And despite his radicalism and despite wanting change, that didn't take away from his country. And I think that's a definition that we need to adopt.
As we end our Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. program today, I would like to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King. One of life's most persistent and urgent questions for all of us, and Martin Luther King challenged us with this: what are you doing for others? What are you doing to serve others in our school, in our community, in our country, and in our world? In remembering Dr. King this week, we will collaborate with Radio TV to ask students, how does Dr. King's activist career inspire you to serve others? One speech alone does not change the world, but I hope you have at least learned something about this passionate man and how you as an individual can utilize that same passion to make changes in your world. Thank you for your respect during this speech. We appreciate your attention, and we appreciate the things that you are going to do to make RHS and our community a better place for everyone. Thank you.